shadow of towering pines, 10-year-old Jacob Carter trudged up the overgrown path to his grandfather's mountain cabin, his faithful German shepherd, Scout, bounding ahead through golden afternoon light. Since Dad lost his job and Mom fell ill, this forgotten family property had become their last hope. For 3 nights straight, Scout's frantic barking had pulled Jacob from troubled sleep, always leading him to the moss-covered well behind the weathered tool shed. The dog would pace, whine, and paw at the ground beyond it, refusing to be calmed. On the 4th morning, as mist still clung to the mountainside, Jacob finally gave in to Scout's persistence and pushed aside the tangle of wild blackberry bushes behind the well. What was hidden there for generations? What secrets had his family kept buried for so long? And how would this discovery transform the desperate future that loomed over them all? Scout's bark echoed across the mountainside as the German shepherd pawed frantically at the tangle of wild blackberry bushes behind the moss-covered well, his tail rigid with urgency that Jacob couldn't ignore any longer. The morning mist still clung to the pines as Jacob, dressed in his worn flannel pajamas, followed his loyal companion through the dew-soaked grass, his bare feet growing numb against the cold earth of his grandfather's property. The cabin behind him stood silent, his father still asleep after another night of restless worry, his mother's labored breathing audible even through the thin wooden walls that now sheltered their broken dreams. Jacob's fingers trembled as he pushed aside the thorny brambles that Scout had been so desperate to get past, the scratches on his arms barely registering as his curiosity overwhelmed his caution. The well itself was old, a crumbling circle of stacked stones that his father had warned him to stay away from, but it wasn't the well that had captured Scout's attention. The dog whined and scratched at something just beyond, partially concealed by decades of undergrowth and deliberate concealment. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as he cleared away more vegetation, revealing what appeared to be an edge, then a corner, then the unmistakable outline of a door, an actual door, embedded right into the mountainside behind the well, as if the mountain itself had swallowed part of a building long ago. The wood was ancient, darkened by time and the elements, yet somehow preserved by the overhanging rock that had protected it from the worst of the mountain weather. With trembling fingers, Jacob cleared more vines away, revealing intricate symbols carved into the weathered surface, circles within circles, strange angular markings that reminded him of the Native American petroglyphs he'd studied in school, and what appeared to be letters in a language he couldn't recognize. The symbols seemed to tell a story, or perhaps serve as a warning, radiating outward from a central point where a heavy iron lock hung, its metal so dark with age it was nearly black against the wooden background. Scout whimpered again, pressing his nose against Jacob's leg as if seeking reassurance that his discovery was important, that his nights of desperate barking hadn't been for nothing. The boy ran his fingers over the carvings, feeling each groove and indentation as if they might speak to him through touch alone, his mind racing with questions that chased each other in dizzying circles. Who had built this? What lay behind it? Why had his parents never mentioned such a strange feature on their new property? The door was no casual addition. Its construction and concealment spoke of purpose, of secrets intentionally hidden away from curious eyes. Jacob's heart pounded against his ribs as he tugged experimentally at the lock, its weight substantial in his small hand, the keyhole a tiny dark mouth that seemed to whisper of mysteries beyond. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open, and his father's voice called out his name, questioning, concerned, pulling him back to the reality of their desperate situation, the mounting medical bills, the final eviction notice from their old apartment, the uncertainty that had driven them to this last resort mountain refuge that had belonged to a grandfather Jacob barely remembered. He let the vines fall back into place, obscuring the door once more, but not before making a silent promise to whatever lay beyond that iron lock. "I'll be back, and somehow, I'll find a way to open you." The dinner table fell silent except for the scrape of forks against mismatched plates, the family's third meal of beans and rice that week casting long shadows across their faces in the cabin's dim light. Jacob pushed his food around, his mind still fixed on the mysterious door, while his parents exchanged tense glances that spoke volumes about unspoken worries. When his father finally broke the silence, his voice carried the weight of months of failure. "I called about that construction job in town," he said, his calloused fingers tightening around a chipped coffee mug. "They hired someone with more experience." His mother reached across the table, her thin fingers trembling slightly from the medication that never quite seemed to keep the pain at bay. "Something will turn up, David," she whispered, though the hope in her voice had grown thinner with each passing week. Jacob watched his father's jaw tighten, the familiar storm brewing behind his tired eyes. "Something needed to turn up 3 months ago, Sarah," he snapped, pushing away from the table. "Before the health insurance ran out, before we lost the house," his voice cracked as he gestured around the cabin. "Living in my dead father's hunting cabin wasn't exactly the retirement plan." His mother's face paled, her voice growing softer. "We need to refill my prescription tomorrow." The words hung in the air, heavy as anvils. Jacob slipped away as his parents' voices rose and fell like thunder across the mountain, retreating to his small bedroom where he spread out his collection of found objects beneath the glow of a flashlight. He had scavenged the cabin thoroughly since their arrival, finding old fishing hooks, a magnifying glass, several paper clips he had bent into makeshift tools, a pocket knife with a broken tip, and now the weathered sketchbook in which he carefully drew what he remembered of the symbols from the door. Scout lay beside his bed, ears perking up at the sound of his mother's muffled cough from the next room, followed by his father's gentler tones, the anger now giving way to the familiar pattern of apology and worry. Jacob stroked the dog's fur, finding comfort in his warmth. "There's something important behind that door, Scout," he whispered. "I can feel it." Outside, the mountain darkness pressed against his window, the wild vastness that had seemed so frightening when they first arrived, now feeling like it held secrets meant specifically for him. From the depths of the cabin came the sound of his mother's medication bottles rattling, followed by his father's frustrated sigh at the sight of how few pills remained. Jacob knew the cost of those tiny capsules, had seen the receipt his father had crumpled and thrown away last time, had calculated the days of work it would take at minimum wage to afford the next refill. He turned back to his drawings, tracing the strange symbols with renewed determination, the conviction growing within him that salvation somehow lay behind that ancient wooden door. In the morning, while his parents argued in hushed voices about whether they could afford both medication and electricity that month, Jacob slipped out with Scout, carrying his collection of makeshift picks to try on the iron lock, each attempt more desperate than the last. When his father called him inside to help unpack the last of their belongings, Jacob found him holding a framed family photo, his eyes red-rimmed and distant. "I promised I'd take care of you both," his father said so quietly that Jacob almost didn't hear him. That night, as his parents' worried whispers filtered through the thin walls, Jacob clutched his sketchbook and made a solemn vow. Whatever secret his grandfather had hidden behind that locked door, he would find it, and somehow, it would save them all. The morning sun filtered through pine branches as Jacob wandered along the overgrown property line, Scout trotting faithfully beside him, both boy and dog mapping the boundaries of their new mountain home. A weathered fence post caught Jacob's eye, its ancient wood bearing the same circular symbols he had seen on the mysterious door, and he crouched to examine it when a deep voice startled him. "Those marks are older than this mountain has a right to remember," said an elderly man standing on the other side of the broken fence, his face creased like the topographical maps Jacob had seen in school, eyes the faded blue of a winter sky. He introduced himself as Thomas Harrison, extending a gnarled hand that bore the calluses of decades working the unyielding mountain soil. When Jacob mentioned his grandfather, the old man's eyes lit with recognition. "Alan Carter and I pulled each other out of more trouble than two fools deserved." He chuckled, inviting Jacob to sit on a fallen log that served as a boundary marker between their properties. "Mr. Harrison spoke of the mountain with reverence, his voice dropping to a near whisper as he described how it had been the site of a brief but intense gold rush in the 1,850 seconds, when men driven by desperation and dreams had carved tunnels into the reluctant earth. "Your great-great-grandfather was among them," the old man revealed, watching Jacob's face carefully. "Jeremiah Carter came with nothing but became a man of importance, though some whispered his fortune came too suddenly to be honest work." Scout pressed against Jacob's leg as Mr. Harrison described how the Carter family had suddenly possessed enough gold to buy half the mountain, only to lose it all just as mysteriously a generation later. "There are those who say the mountain took back what wasn't rightfully claimed," the old man continued, his weathered fingers tracing the same circular symbol Jacob had found on the door. "Some treasures demand a price beyond gold," the mountain wind whispered through the pines as Mr. Beatty. Harrison spoke of tunnels that honeycombed the mountain's heart, of men who entered seeking fortune and emerged changed or never returned at all, of maps divided and hidden to protect secrets that had cost lives. "Your grandfather was obsessed with finding the truth of it all," he said, his voice growing serious, spent his final years searching these woods, making notes, studying old papers. Jacob's heart quickened as he asked about the well, trying to sound casual, and watched the old man's face tighten with concern. "That well never held water," Mr. Harrison said sharply. "It marks something else entirely, something your grandfather discovered too late." He gripped Jacob's arm with surprising strength, his eyes suddenly intense. "Listen carefully, boy. This mountain holds secrets that have destroyed men stronger than you or me. Whatever you think you've found near that well, whatever door you believe might lead to answers, walk away from it." Scout growled softly, sensing the tension, as Mr. Harrison pressed something into Jacob's palm, a smooth river stone bearing the same circular marking. "If you ever see lights near that well at night, or hear voices when no one should be there, you come to me immediately," the old man insisted. As Jacob turned to leave, Mr. Harrison called after him one final warning that followed the boy home like a shadow. "The Carter fortune wasn't lost, Jacob. It was hidden for protection, and what guards it doesn't distinguish between those who come with greed and those who come with need." That night, Jacob lay awake, the river stone cool against his palm, wondering how Mr. Harrison had known about the door he hadn't mentioned, and why his parents had never told him about a family fortune that might solve all their problems. The attic stairs creaked beneath Jacob's weight as he climbed into the shadows above the cabin, flashlight gripped in his sweaty palm, the conversation with Mr. Harrison replaying in his mind. Dust motes swirled in the narrow beam of light, dancing across forgotten trunks and cardboard boxes that contained the remnants of his grandfather's life, a life Jacob now realized had been filled with secrets. Scout waited at the bottom of the ladder, whining softly as Jacob began his systematic exploration of the space, carefully shifting aside Christmas ornaments, old fishing gear, and moth-eaten winter clothes. His fingers brushed against a wooden crate tucked beneath the eaves, its contents protected by a faded quilt that disintegrated at his touch, revealing stacks of leather-bound books and yellowed papers. Jacob's heart raced as he lifted out the topmost volume, a journal bound in cracked leather with his grandfather's initials burned into the cover, A.C. The pages were filled with meticulous handwriting, dates spanning decades, with detailed observations of the mountain, newspaper clippings about mining rights, and hand-drawn maps that made Jacob's breath catch when he recognized the area around the well. He tucked the journal into his shirt and continued searching, finding a row of books that appeared untouched for generations, their spines rigid with age and neglect. One volume caught his eye, slightly out of alignment with the others, titled Mining Engineering Principles 1892, that seemed oddly specific among the classic novels surrounding it. When Jacob pulled it from the shelf, he immediately sensed something was different, the book too light, its balance wrong in his hands. The pages didn't separate when he tried to open it, and upon closer inspection, he discovered they were glued together with a rectangular cavity cut into the center. Nestled inside this hiding place lay a brass key, its surface etched with the same circular symbols Jacob had seen on the door behind the well, its teeth forming an unusual pattern unlike any house key he'd ever seen. As Jacob carefully pocketed his discoveries, a vehicle's engine rumbled up the gravel driveway below, causing Scout to erupt into furious barking that echoed through the cabin. Jacob scrambled down from the attic to find his loyal companion standing rigid at the front window, hackles raised, a low growl emanating from deep in his chest. Through the grimy glass, Jacob spotted an expensive black SUV with tinted windows and a corporate logo on the door that he couldn't quite make out. His father stepped onto the porch to meet the visitors, two men in crisp suits who seemed oddly formal for the rural mountain setting, while Scout positioned himself protectively between the window and Jacob, his behavior markedly different from his usual friendly greeting of visitors. The German shepherd's suspicious vigilance continued throughout the evening, even after the strangers had departed, leaving Jacob's father holding a business card that he studied with a mixture of hope and suspicion. That night, long after his parents had fallen asleep, Jacob sat cross-legged on his bed with the journal open before him, the brass key catching the moonlight as he turned it over in his fingers, discovering an inscription along its shaft that had initially escaped his notice. "What was buried in darkness shall come to light, but beware the guardians who hunger still." Outside his window, Scout suddenly raised his head from his paws, ears alert, eyes fixed on the distant well, and let out a single, warning bark that made Jacob's skin prickle, with the certainty that something had changed on the mountain, that by finding the key, he had set in motion events his grandfather had both anticipated and feared. The morning fog clung to the mountainside like a shroud as Jacob crept toward the hidden door, Scout padding silently beside him, the brass key cool against his palm. Jacob had waited until his parents left for town, his father in search of work, his mother for a doctor's appointment they could barely afford, before gathering his courage to approach the mysterious entrance that had consumed his thoughts. The blackberry vines parted more easily today, as if the mountain itself had decided to grant him access to its secrets, revealing the ancient wooden door with its cryptic symbols that seemed to shift in meaning under the filtered forest light. Jacob's hands trembled as he aligned the key with the iron lock, noticing how the circular pattern on the key's head matched perfectly with the central symbol carved into the weathered wood. He held his breath as he inserted the key, expecting resistance but finding instead that it slid in smoothly, as if the lock had been recently oiled despite decades of apparent neglect. The mechanism turned with a series of heavy clicks that reverberated through the stone around them, sounds that spoke of serious engineering beyond what a simple cabin door would require. Scout whined softly, pressing against Jacob's leg as the boy summoned his courage and pulled on the iron handle that had appeared from behind a pivoting wooden panel. The door swung outward with surprising ease, releasing a breath of cool, stale air that carried the faint mineral scent of earth long undisturbed. What lay beyond made Jacob's heart stutter in his chest, a narrow tunnel extending into the mountain's heart, roughly hewn at first, but transitioning to carefully constructed stone walls reinforced with ancient timber supports that disappeared into darkness beyond the reach of daylight. The passage was just tall enough for an adult to walk through hunched over, but Jacob, at 10 years old, could stand fully upright beneath the low ceiling. Water trickled somewhere in the blackness ahead, a gentle symphony of drips creating music that had perhaps played unheard for generations. Scout took a hesitant step forward, sniffing the threshold but refusing to cross it, his usually adventurous spirit subdued by some animal instinct that gave Jacob pause. Without a proper flashlight, with only the key and his curiosity as companions, the boy knew he couldn't safely venture into such absolute darkness, regardless of how the mystery beckoned. As he hesitated at the entrance, gathering his resolve to return better equipped, a glint of metal caught his eye from a small alcove carved into the tunnel wall just inside the entrance. Jacob reached carefully into the recess and extracted an old miner's lamp, its brass housing tarnished with age but still intact, its reservoir still containing oil that had turned viscous with time. When he turned the lamp over, his breath caught at the discovery of letters etched into the metal base. J. Carter, 1852. His ancestor's name and the date confirming everything, Mr. Harrison had told him about his family's connection to the mountain's mining history. Jacob quickly returned the lamp to its niche, promising silently to retrieve it on his next visit, and reluctantly pulled the door closed behind him, the lock engaging automatically with a definitive click that echoed with finality. As he carefully concealed the entrance once more with vines and branches, Scout suddenly growled, his attention fixed on the ridge above them where Jacob briefly glimpsed movement among the trees, the sense of being watched raising goosebumps along his arms and quickening his pace as he headed back to the safety of the cabin, the weight of family secrets heavy in his pocket where the key now resided. The black SUV returned 3 days later, gravel crunching beneath expensive tires as it pulled up to the cabin's weathered porch, where Scout immediately began barking with unusual aggression. Jacob watched from his bedroom window as a tall man in an impeccably tailored suit stepped out, his polished leather shoes incongruous against the mountain dirt, his smile too practiced as he extended a manicured hand to Jacob's father who had emerged from the workshop where he had been repairing broken furniture for extra money. Mr. Carter, Richard Blackwood from Meridian Development, the stranger introduced himself, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. I represent investors interested in acquiring mountain properties for an exclusive residential project. Jacob slipped downstairs, positioning himself in the kitchen where he could hear the conversation while remaining unseen, noting how Scout had positioned himself between the visitor and the path that led toward the well, his hackles raised despite his father's commands to be quiet. The man's offer came with practiced casualness that couldn't disguise its extraordinary nature, 5 times what the property might reasonably be worth, cash payment, with the option for the Carter family to remain in residence for 6 months while finding new accommodations. Jacob watched the hope kindle in his father's tired eyes, saw how his shoulders straightened slightly at the prospect of financial salvation, and felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. "This land has been in my family for generations," his father said hesitantly, though Jacob could hear the temptation in his voice. "My father would have never sold it." The visitor nodded sympathetically, producing documents from a leather portfolio. "I understand family legacy, Mr. Carter. But sometimes opportunities arise that previous generations couldn't have anticipated." His practiced smile never reached his eyes, which kept darting toward the forest behind the cabin, toward the direction of the well. Jacob's mother emerged from her bedroom, her face pale but composed as she joined the conversation, asking practical questions about the offer while Jacob quietly slipped outside, circling around to where the visitor had parked. Through the open window of the SUV, he could hear Blackwood's voice as the man stepped away to take a phone call, his tone dramatically different from the genial one he had used with Jacob's parents. "The Carter property is exactly where the surveys indicated," the man said tersely. "The old man must have known what was here. Why else would he have built so close to the site? We need to secure it before anyone else realizes what's hidden there." A pause as the person on the other end spoke. "No, they have no idea what they're sitting on. The father's desperate enough to sell, practically salivating at the offer. Once we acquire the property, we can begin extraction immediately, without the usual permit complications." Jacob ducked behind a bush as Blackwood ended his call and returned to his parents, who were now examining the paperwork with cautious optimism. That evening, as his parents discussed the unexpected windfall that could solve their financial troubles and pay for his mother's treatments, Jacob sat on his bed clutching his grandfather's journal, certain that the visitor's interest had nothing to do with luxury homes and everything to do with what lay behind that locked door in the mountainside. When he heard his father mention signing preliminary paperwork the following week, Jacob knew his exploration of the tunnel couldn't wait any longer, no matter how unprepared he might be for whatever secrets the mountain was protecting. Moonlight spilled through the cabin window as Jacob hunched beneath his blanket, flashlight illuminating the brittle pages of his grandfather's journal. Scout curled protectively at his feet while his parents' worried discussions about the developer's offer drifted through the thin walls. The first entries were mundane, weather observations and notes on local wildlife. But as Jacob carefully turned each fragile page, the narrative began to shift toward obsession, his grandfather's handwriting growing more urgent, more cramped with each passing month. "The company records confirm what I've long suspected," read an entry from 1998. "The partnership was built on deception from the beginning. Meridian Mining wasn't founded on lucky strikes but on calculated theft." Jacob's heart quickened as he recognized the same company name connected to the developer who had visited them, suggesting a connection spanning generations. Subsequent pages detailed his grandfather's painstaking research into mining claims from the 1852, property deeds with signatures that didn't match county records, and references to native lands that had been systematically stolen through fraudulent documents. The Carter name was deliberately tarnished. One passage declared in bold underlined script, "Jeremiah didn't steal from the company. He discovered their crime and tried to expose it." The most disturbing entries came from his grandfather's final year, describing surveillance he believed was being conducted on the property, mysterious figures spotted near the well, and his decision to protect what he called the evidence and the legacy. "I've sealed the entrance with a lock that only a Carter would know to find the key for," he wrote. "Inside is everything needed to reclaim what was stolen, but the true map must never fall into their hands." Jacob nearly dropped the journal when he read the next lines. "I've divided the map into 3 parts for safety. One piece I keep with me, hidden where only family would think to look. The second I've entrusted to Harrison, the only man on this mountain I still trust. The third is concealed where it all began, beneath the guardian's gaze that has watched over our secret for a century." The final pages contained increasingly paranoid ramblings about being followed in town, phone lines being tapped, and a company determined to extract what was never theirs to take. The very last entry, dated just weeks before his grandfather's supposed accident, chilled Jacob to his core. "If anything happens to me, know that the truth waits in the mountain's heart. The door will open only for Carter blood. The path is protected by mechanisms designed by Jeremiah himself. What was buried in darkness shall come to light when the need is greatest, when the family faces its darkest hour. Until then, the guardian keeps watch." Jacob closed the journal with trembling hands as a floorboard creaked outside his bedroom door, followed by his father's heavy footsteps retreating down the hallway. The developer's words echoed in his mind, connecting with his grandfather's warnings like pieces of a puzzle falling into terrible alignment. Whatever lay within the mountain had nearly cost his grandfather his life. Yet now it seemed their family's salvation might depend on uncovering those same secrets before Meridian could secure the site and erase the evidence forever. The town library occupied an imposing Victorian building at the center of Pinecrest, its stone facade darkened with age, tall windows reflecting the mountain peaks that dominated the horizon in every direction. Jacob followed his mother through the heavy oak doors, clutching his backpack that concealed his grandfather's journal, his eyes adjusting to the diffused light filtering through stained glass as the scent of old books and furniture polish enveloped them. His mother had suggested the trip as research for a school project, unaware of Jacob's true motive, finding historical information that might explain the mysterious tunnel and his grandfather's cryptic warnings. They approached the reference desk where an elderly woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun peered at them over wire-rimmed glasses, her fingers pausing on the ancient keyboard before her. Sarah Carter. His mother introduced herself. "And this is my son Jacob. We've recently moved into my father-in-law's property, up on Raven Ridge." The librarian's expression transformed instantly, her academic detachment giving way to intense curiosity as she straightened in her chair. "Carter, did you say? From the Raven Ridge property?" When Jacob's mother confirmed this, the woman introduced herself as Eleanor Winters, local historian and head librarian for 37 years, her voice lowering as she added, "The Carter name has quite a history in these mountains, not all of it flattering, I'm afraid." She led them to a private reading room lined with county records and historical photographs, including one that made Jacob freeze in place, a faded image of men standing before a mine entrance that looked strikingly similar to the door he had discovered behind the well. "Your great-great-grandfather Jeremiah Carter was something of a controversial figure, Miss," Winters explained, pulling out a leather-bound volume of newspaper clippings. "He came here in 1850 as a mining engineer for the Sierra Nevada Mining Company, which later became Meridian Mining." Jacob's heart raced at the mention of the same company name, while Miss Ponikin from himself. Winters continued her history lesson, seemingly oblivious to his reaction. Carter was brilliant, by all accounts. He designed innovative drainage systems and support structures that allowed deeper excavation than had previously been possible. She pointed to technical drawings bearing his ancestor's signature, revealing the same circular symbols Jacob had seen on the door. But in 1853, he was publicly accused of stealing gold and company documents. The charges claimed he had constructed a secret entrance to bypass the company's accounting systems. His mother listened politely, treating the story as quaint family history, but Jacob hung on every word as Miss Winters described how Jeremiah had vanished for 3 months following the accusations, only to return with enough wealth to purchase significant mountain acreage, including the land where their cabin now stood. The company tried repeatedly to reclaim the property through legal channels, claiming it contained valuable mineral deposits that Carter had illegally appropriated, but they could never prove their case, the librarian explained, showing them court documents yellowed with age. What fascinated me most was that despite his sudden wealth, Jeremiah lived modestly and focused on protecting the mountain rather than extracting more from it. She studied Jacob's face intently, as if searching for a family resemblance, before adding, "There were rumors that he discovered something in those mines beyond gold, something the company was desperate to conceal, and that he hid evidence somewhere on the property." As they prepared to leave, Miss Winters pressed a small cloth-wrapped package into Jacob's hands. "Your grandfather asked me to keep this safe before his accident," she whispered. "He said a time would come when it needed to return to Carter hands. I believe that time is now." The package from Miss Winters contained a small brass compass with the Carter family crest, its needle pointing unerringly toward the mountain rather than north, a peculiarity that sent Jacob back to his grandfather's journal with renewed determination. Late that evening, while his parents discussed the developer's contract in hushed voices at the kitchen table, Jacob reread the cryptic passages about hiding places, focusing on a recurring phrase that had initially seemed meaningless. "The hearth guards what fire cannot destroy." Scout watched attentively as Jacob knelt before the massive stone fireplace that dominated the cabin's main room, running his fingers along the rough surface, pressing experimentally against stones that appeared slightly misaligned. His persistence was rewarded when a large stone near the back of the firebox shifted under pressure, revealing a small cavity behind it that had been carefully chiseled into the masonry. Jacob's fingers trembled as he reached into the darkness, connecting with something flat and metallic that had been protected from decades of heat by the surrounding stonework. He extracted a rectangular tin box, tarnished with age but intact, its lid emblazoned with the same circular symbol that appeared on the door behind the well. The anticipation nearly overwhelmed him as he carefully pried open the box to reveal its contents. A piece of yellowed parchment, preserved between sheets of waxed paper, 1/3 of what was clearly a larger document. Unfolding it with extreme care, Jacob found himself looking at an intricately drawn section of tunnel systems, chambers, and what appeared to be mechanical components, all rendered in faded brown ink with meticulous attention to detail. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the lines precise despite their age, but the frustration was immediate and crushing, for the fragment ended abruptly at jagged edges where it had been deliberately torn, rendering the information tantalizingly incomplete. Jacob recognized certain features that must correspond to the tunnel entrance he had discovered, including notations about the door and lock mechanisms, but the map abruptly terminated before revealing where the passages ultimately led. In one corner, barely visible in the faint light, he could make out what appeared to be a partial warning, written in the same elegant script as his grandfather's journal. Beware the third chamber where waters cross, for the guardian, the rest lost to the missing sections. Footsteps approached from the kitchen, forcing Jacob to hastily replace the stone before his father entered the room, the map piece now safely tucked inside his shirt against his pounding heart. "Everything okay, son?" his father asked, eyeing the sooty marks on Jacob's hands with suspicion. "Just looking for a rock for my science project." Jacob lied, the weight of his discovery making his voice sound strange even to his own ears. That night, by flashlight beneath his blankets, he carefully examined every millimeter of the parchment, finding minuscule notations about pressure plates, tripwires, and what seemed to be references to defensive mechanisms built into the tunnel system itself. His grandfather's journal had mentioned 3 pieces divided for safety, and now Jacob understood why. Each fragment alone revealed enough to be tantalizing but not enough to be useful, like pieces of a puzzle designed to protect its solution from anyone who didn't possess all 3 sections. As he finally drifted toward sleep, the map piece secured in a waterproof bag beneath his mattress, Jacob realized that time was working against him. With the developer's offer moving forward, and 2 more map pieces still to locate before he could uncover whatever secret had been worth hiding for generations. The corporate convoy arrived at noon, 3 black SUVs with tinted windows kicking up dust on the gravel driveway, disrupting the mountain quiet with their intrusion. Richard Blackwood emerged from the lead vehicle, flanked by 2 men in expensive suits who surveyed the property with calculating eyes, while a 4th man, distinguished by a bright red tie and an air of authority, consulted a tablet displaying topographical images of the mountain. Jacob watched from his bedroom window as his father greeted them warily on the porch, Scout bristling beside him, the German shepherd's instincts clearly aligning with the growing unease Jacob felt. The men introduced themselves as executives from Meridian Mining Corporation, their business cards exchanged with practiced smiles that never reached their eyes, while Jacob crept to the top of the stairs to listen. "Our environmental impact team has completed their preliminary surveys," the man with the red tie explained, his voice carrying the polished authority of someone accustomed to boardrooms rather than mountain cabins. "The results are quite promising, particularly in the northwestern quadrant where your property extends into the ridge." Jacob's father frowned, confusion evident in his voice as he responded, "I thought Meridian Development was interested in building luxury homes. What does mining have to do with residential construction?" The momentary silence felt weighted with calculation before Blackwood smoothly intervened. "Meridian Development is a subsidiary of Meridian Mining, Mr. Carter. Our parent company maintains mineral rights throughout this region dating back to the 1852. The conversation moved to the porch where the executives spread out maps on the weathered railing, pointing to areas that corresponded precisely with the location of the hidden door Jacob had discovered. "These deposits are particularly promising," the red-tied executive continued, tapping a spot on the map that made Jacob's heart race with recognition. "Our ground-penetrating radar indicates extensive tunnel systems, possibly from the original mining operations. We believe your grandfather may have, shall we say, rediscovered certain resources that rightfully belong to the company." Jacob's father stiffened, his posture changing as suspicion crept into his expression. "My father was many things, but he wasn't a thief. This property has been in our family for generations." The executive exchanged glances with his colleagues, a silent communication that Jacob understood instinctively as danger. "There were certain irregularities with how your ancestors acquired this land," Blackwood said carefully. Our legal team has uncovered documents suggesting the original transfer may not have been entirely legitimate. Jacob's father invited them inside with reluctance painted across his features, the conversation continuing in the kitchen while Jacob slipped outside, circling around to peer through the window where he could see his mother's face growing increasingly concerned. Scout positioned himself protectively near Jacob, both of them witnessing the corporate men gesturing emphatically about water rights, mineral claims, and historical precedents. Phrases like legal reclamation and rightful ownership punctuating their persuasive pitch. When the visitors finally departed 3 hours later, leaving behind revised contracts and subtle threats disguised as legal concerns, Jacob found his father standing at the edge of the property, staring toward the hidden well with newfound suspicion. "They know something about this land that we don't, Jake," he said quietly, his weathered hand resting briefly on his son's shoulder. "Your grandfather was trying to protect something here, something valuable enough that these corporate vultures are still circling after all these years." The afternoon shadows stretched like grasping fingers across the forest floor as Jacob ventured deeper into the woods, his grandfather's journal tucked safely in his backpack, Scout trotting faithfully ahead on their daily exploration. Since the corporate visit, Jacob had felt a growing urgency to uncover more secrets before the men in suits could claim the mountain and whatever lay beneath it. His path today taking him in a wide circuit around the hidden door to search for any other signs his ancestors might have left behind. The forest felt different somehow, the usual peaceful rustling of leaves now carrying an undercurrent of watchfulness that prickled the hair on Jacob's neck, causing him to glance repeatedly over his shoulder at nothing but shifting shadows and swaying branches. Scout sensed it too, his playful bounding giving way to alert vigilance, ears constantly swiveling to track sounds too faint for human hearing, his path increasingly circling back to check on Jacob rather than ranging ahead. The first concrete sign that something was wrong came when Scout suddenly froze, his body rigid with tension, a low growl rumbling from deep in his chest as his gaze fixed on a dense thicket of mountain laurel where nothing appeared to move. "What is it, boy?" Jacob whispered, his question answered immediately by the unmistakable sound of a twig snapping where no wildlife would be so careless. Fear surged through Jacob's veins as a figure emerged partially from behind a massive oak 20 yards away. A man in dark clothing with a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, his movements suggesting he had been paralleling their path for some time, watching, following, closing the distance incrementally. Scout's protective instinct exploded into action before Jacob could even process the danger, the German shepherd launching forward with a ferocity Jacob had never witnessed. His usually friendly companion transformed into a snarling guardian, covering the distance to the stranger with breathtaking speed. The man cursed, stumbling backward in alarm, dropping something metallic that clattered against rocks as he retreated from the advancing animal whose teeth were now bared in unmistakable threat. "Call off your dog," the man shouted, his voice unfamiliar yet carrying a note of authority that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed. But Jacob remained frozen, watching as Scout continued his aggressive advance, herding the intruder away from his young master with determined precision. The standoff ended abruptly when the man turned and crashed through the underbrush in full retreat, Scout pursuing for 50 yards to ensure the threat was truly departing before returning to Jacob's side, alert but calmer, his mission accomplished. Heart still hammering in his chest, Jacob cautiously approached the spot where the stranger had stood, finding a sophisticated electronic device half hidden among fallen leaves, its sleek black casing housing a small screen and various sensors that blinked with active power. The Meridian Mining logo was emblazoned on its side, alongside the words Property Analyzer Model TX7, its purpose clear when Jacob experimentally pressed a button and watched a radar-like display illuminate, showing subsurface density readings with particular concentration around coordinates that Jacob recognized as corresponding with the hidden door location. With trembling hands, he switched off the device and buried it in his backpack, the corporate interest in their property now undeniably focused on the very secret he was racing to uncover, the realization hitting him with cold certainty that he was no longer just exploring family mysteries, but was caught in something much larger and potentially dangerous. The morning fog had barely lifted when Jacob made his way to Mr. Harrison's cabin, Scout alert at his side, the strange encounter with the Meridian employee still fresh in his mind. The old man was waiting on his porch as if expecting them, a rocking chair creaking gently beneath his weathered frame, eyes that missed nothing tracking their approach across the dew-dampened clearing. "I saw their vehicles yesterday," Mr. Harrison stated without preamble, his gnarled fingers wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee that scented the morning air. "The suits are back, just like your grandfather always feared they would be." Jacob nodded, describing the corporate visit and the man who had followed him in the woods, watching as the old man's expression hardened with each detail, the lines in his face deepening like the mountain crevices that had witnessed a century of secrets. "Your grandfather knew this day would come," Mr. Harrison said quietly, setting his mug aside and pushing himself upright with effort that spoke of bones grown weary with age and the burden of keeping promises. "Come inside, boy." The interior of the cabin smelled of wood smoke and time, walls lined with bookshelves and display cases holding artifacts that chronicled mountain life across generations. Fossils and arrowheads alongside mining tools and faded photographs in which Jacob recognized ancestors whose features mirrored his own. Mr. Harrison moved to an ancient roll-top desk, unlocking it with a key he wore around his neck, the mechanism protesting with a series of clicks that seemed to speak of decades of patient waiting. "Alan came to me one night, not long before the accident that took him," the old man explained, his voice dropping to a near whisper though they were alone in the cabin. "He was afraid, more afraid than I had ever seen him, convinced that Meridian had discovered what he had been researching all those years." From within a hidden compartment in the desk, Mr. Harrison extracted a small metal tube, the kind architects used to protect valuable drawings, its brass surface darkened with age, but still bearing the circular symbols Jacob now recognized as his family's secret mark. "He made me swear to keep this safe until one of his blood returned seeking answers. Made me promise to reveal it only when the mountain itself seemed in danger." The old man handed the tube to Jacob with ceremonial gravity, their hands briefly connecting across generations of shared purpose. "He said his grandson would come one day, and that I would know when the time was right." Jacob's fingers trembled as he carefully unscrewed the tube's end cap, extracting a rolled piece of parchment that matched precisely the fragment he had discovered in the fireplace, its edges torn in a pattern that would interconnect perfectly with the first piece. Spreading it gently on the desk's surface, Jacob saw that this second section revealed more of the tunnel system, including chambers and what appeared to be mechanical details of traps or protective measures, notes in his great-great-grandfather's handwriting, marking points labeled "Secondary Defense" and "Guardian's Approach." Mr. Harrison leaned over the map, his finger tracing a particular notation near what seemed to be an underground waterway. "This section shows what Jeremiah built to protect whatever lies at the heart of the mountain," he explained, his voice filled with respect. "Your grandfather believed it was more than just gold that Meridian wanted to hide, that the company had discovered something in those mountains they never publicly acknowledged. Something that would have changed everything if the truth had been revealed." Scout whined softly from the doorway, his attention fixed on the window, prompting Jacob to carefully roll the precious document and return it to its protective tube. "The corporate men are back at your cabin, Mr. Harrison warned, peering through lace curtains toward the road below. "They won't stop until they've secured what they believe belongs to them, the same claim they've been making since your great-great-grandfather first stood against them." The kitchen fell silent after dinner, Jacob's mother retiring early with a headache brought on by stress while Jacob helped his father wash dishes, the weight of unspoken questions hanging between them like the mountain mist. When the last plate was dried and put away, Jacob's father sank heavily into a chair at the table, gesturing for his son to join him, his weathered face carved with shadows from the single lamp that illuminated their conversation. "I saw you coming back from old Harrison's place today," he began, his voice rough with emotion he rarely displayed. "There are things about our family you should know. Things I should have told you before we moved here." Jacob's heart quickened as his father reached for an old photograph tucked in his wallet, sliding it across the wooden surface, the image showing a younger version of his grandfather standing proudly before the cabin, mountains rising majestically behind him. "My father, your grandfather, wasn't just a reclusive mountain man like people around here thought," he continued, eyes fixed on the photograph as if it might suddenly speak and fill the gaps in his knowledge. "He was an investigator. Spent 20 years working for the State Environmental Protection Office before retiring to focus on what he called his personal project." Scout settled at Jacob's feet as his father described how the grandfather had become /well for the other Bran. obsessed with proving corruption and environmental crimes committed by a mining corporation that had operated in the region for generations. Meridian Mining, Jacob's father said, the name hanging in the air between them, confirmation of connections Jacob had already begun to suspect. Dad believed they had falsified environmental impact studies, bribed officials, and covered up toxic contamination of groundwater that caused cancer clusters in 3 mountain communities. The kitchen seemed to grow smaller as Jacob's father leaned forward, voice dropping to a near whisper, though they were alone in the cabin. The official report said he died in a hiking accident, a simple fall on a mountain trail he had walked hundreds of times before. Bitterness crept into his voice, hands curling into fists on the tabletop. But I never believed it. 2 days before he died, he called me, more excited than I had ever heard him. Said he had found definitive proof, documents that would expose everything Meridian had been hiding for over a century. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending sparks up the chimney as Jacob's father continued, revealing how he had searched the cabin after the funeral but found nothing, how local authorities had dismissed his concerns about foul play, how he had eventually given up and moved away from the mountains that held both his father and the truth. When your mother got sick and we lost everything, this place was our only option, he admitted, shame coloring his words. I never wanted to come back here, never wanted to face the questions I couldn't answer about what really happened to him. Jacob sat perfectly still, absorbing revelations that connected so perfectly with what he had discovered, wanting desperately to share his findings but held back by uncertainty about how his father would react to knowing his son had been exploring the very mysteries that might have gotten his grandfather killed. These corporate men showing up now, offering too much money for land that's been in our family for generations, it can't be coincidence, his father concluded, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. Whatever my father found, whatever he was trying to protect, they're still looking for it, and they're willing to pay a fortune to make sure no one else ever finds it. Jacob returned from school to find the cabin door slightly ajar, a detail that immediately set his heart racing, since his mother should have been home resting while his father was in town applying for jobs. Scout, who had been waiting in the yard, sensed the wrongness instantly, his playful demeanor transforming as he pushed past Jacob with a low growl rumbling in his chest, entering the cabin ahead of his young master like a furry guardian. The interior appeared normal at first glance, the main room untouched, but as Jacob moved deeper into the cabin, calling for his mother with increasing urgency, he detected subtle signs of intrusion. A kitchen drawer left partially open, a chair slightly misaligned, the faint scent of unfamiliar cologne lingering in the air. Relief flooded through him when he found his mother asleep in her bedroom, her medication having drawn her into a deep slumber that had rendered her oblivious to whatever had transpired. But that relief evaporated when he heard Scout barking frantically from upstairs. The attic door stood wide open, the folding ladder fully extended in silent testimony to an uninvited ascent, and as Jacob climbed the creaking steps, the destruction above became immediately apparent. Everything had been systematically ransacked, boxes overturned, their contents spilled across the dusty floorboards, his grandfather's belongings scattered in a manner that spoke not of random vandalism, but of methodical searching. The wooden crate that had contained the journal had been pried open, its lock broken, the quilt that had covered it shredded as if in frustration. Footprints in the dust revealed that at least 2 people had conducted the search, their movements focused primarily around the areas where Jacob had found the journal and key, suggesting they knew precisely what they were looking for but had failed to find it. Scout circled the attic nervously, sniffing at the window that stood slightly open, its frame splintered where it had been forced from outside, the glass pane cracked but intact. The German shepherd's fur remained raised along his spine, his tension communicating clearly that the intruders might not have been gone long, perhaps interrupted by his return from school and the dog's protective presence. With trembling hands, Jacob checked the hiding place beneath his mattress where he had concealed the map pieces and journal, finding them undisturbed, their existence still a secret, though how much longer they would remain so seemed increasingly uncertain. When his father returned home an hour later, his face darkened with fury as he surveyed the damage. Immediately calling the local sheriff, despite Jacob's certainty that official reports would accomplish nothing against the power of Meridian Mining. They were looking for something specific. His father observed grimly as they secured the broken window with plywood, his eyes lingering on tire tracks pressed into the mud behind the cabin, tracks that matched the corporate SUVs that had visited them days earlier. That night, Jacob slept with Scout positioned protectively at his bedroom door, the map pieces and journal now hidden inside a waterproof container buried beneath the loose floorboard under his bed. His grandfather's warning about danger echoing in his mind as he drifted into uneasy dreams filled with shadowy figures, searching endlessly through mountain tunnels for secrets that had remained hidden for generations. Dawn painted the mountain with golden light as Jacob sat cross-legged on his bedroom floor. Grandfather's journal open before him, Scout keeping watchful, guard by the window after a night of interrupted sleep following the break-in. The corporate intrusion had only strengthened Jacob's resolve to uncover the complete truth before Meridian could steal whatever remained of his family's legacy. His attention now focused on a page he had initially overlooked, containing what appeared to be a poem written in his grandfather's increasingly erratic handwriting. Where 3 pines stand as brothers tall, guarding secrets since the fall, hollow heart of eldest tree holds what eyes were meant to see. Beneath the guardian's watchful gaze, where water whispers ancient ways, the final piece awaits a hand of Carter blood to save the land. The cryptic verses nagged at Jacob's memory, connecting with something Mr. Harrison had mentioned about his grandfather hiding things where only family would think to look. When Jacob's parents left for his mother's medical appointment in the distant city hospital, he seized the opportunity, tucking the journal into his backpack alongside the 2 map pieces already in his possession, whistling for Scout to follow as they slipped into the forest toward the well. The morning woods felt alive with birdsong and movement, yet Jacob couldn't shake the sensation of being observed, his path deliberately meandering to ensure no one followed them to their destination. The well came into view through the trees, but rather than approaching it directly, Jacob studied the surrounding landscape, remembering childhood lessons about triangulation and reference points from camping trips with his father. 3 pines standing as brothers, he murmured to himself, scanning the ridgeline until his gaze settled on a formation that seemed to answer the riddle. 3 massive pine trees growing so close together their trunks almost touched. Sentinels, overlooking the well from the higher ground beyond it. Scout bounded ahead as Jacob climbed the gentle slope, the German shepherd's excitement growing as they approached the trees that had clearly stood for centuries, their massive trunks wider than Jacob could encircle with his arms, their branches creating a cathedral-like canopy above. Jacob walked slowly around each pine, searching for anything unusual, when Scout's behavior suddenly changed, his nose working furiously at the base of the largest tree, pawing at a section where the bark appeared subtly different. Kneeling beside his faithful companion, Jacob discovered that what had initially looked like natural damage was actually a carefully disguised door set into the trunk, a rectangular section of bark that had been preserved and replaced over a hollow carved into the living wood. His fingers traced what he now recognized as the faint outline of the circular Carter symbol, nearly invisible beneath layers of lichen, confirming this was no natural formation but his grandfather's final hiding place. The concealed panel slid aside with gentle pressure, revealing a dark cavity within the massive trunk, a hiding place that had remained undisturbed for years until Scout's keen senses had detected the human manipulation of the natural world. Jacob reached inside, his fingers connecting with the cool metal of a watertight ammunition case, military surplus according to the faded markings, secured with a combination lock that required no key that might be lost. Remembering his father's birthday, the same combination that had opened his grandfather's fishing tackle box years ago, Jacob tried the sequence with trembling fingers, rewarded by the satisfying click of the mechanism releasing its hold. Inside, protected from time and elements, lay the 3rd piece of parchment, its torn edges perfectly matching the 2 fragments already in his possession, alongside a sealed envelope addressed simply, "To my grandson when the mountain calls." The letter inside, written in his grandfather's steady hand, not the increasingly paranoid scrawl of his final journal entries, confirmed everything Jacob had pieced together. "The truth of our family lies within the mountain," his grandfather wrote. What Jeremiah Carter discovered was not merely gold, but evidence of corporate crimes spanning generations. The tunnel contains proof of stolen land, environmental destruction, and toxic contamination that Meridian has concealed for over a century. The map will guide you past the protections Jeremiah built to keep this evidence safe from those who would destroy it. But beware the guardian at the heart of the mountain, a final defense that will recognize only Carter blood. Trust Harrison, trust your instincts, and above all, trust Scout, whose ancestors have protected our family's secret for generations, just as his bloodline was chosen to do. The afternoon sun slanted through Jacob's bedroom window, casting a golden glow across his bed where all 3 parchment fragments lay carefully arranged, their torn edges aligned with painstaking precision to form a complete document for the first time in decades. Scout lay protectively at the door while Jacob used small strips of transparent tape to temporarily secure the connections, creating a unified map that finally revealed the full scope of what his ancestors had hidden within the mountain. The assembled parchment measured nearly 2 feet square, its surface covered with intricate lines, notations, and symbols drawn in several different inks, suggesting additions made across generations. The craftsmanship so precise it resembled architectural blueprints more than a treasure map from adventure stories. The entrance Jacob had already discovered was clearly marked near the top, opening into a primary tunnel that extended deep into the mountainside before branching into multiple passages, some marked with warning symbols and others with notations like false path or defensive mechanism engaged. The main route descended through what appeared to be naturally occurring caverns that had been enhanced with constructed elements, including bridges across underground streams and reinforced chambers that must have served as storage or work areas during the original mining operations. Jacob's finger traced the recommended path, noting how it deliberately avoided certain areas marked with skull symbols or cryptic phrases like pressure triggers and collapse zone, the intended route requiring specific turns and actions that seemed designed to confuse anyone without the map. Approximately halfway through the system, a detailed drawing showed what appeared to be a mechanical device installed in the tunnel ceiling, accompanied by a warning in faded script. The first guardian tests the seeker's knowledge, step only where Carter boots have trod before. Beyond this point, the tunnel descended more steeply, passing alongside an underground waterway before opening into a large chamber where the map's creator had drawn a detailed rendering of what appeared to be a life-sized mechanical figure positioned before a sealed doorway. The notation beside it chilling Jacob to the core. The guardian of the threshold permits passage only to those of Carter blood. All others will trigger the final defense. Beyond this imposing sentinel lay the chamber marked with an elaborate X, identified simply as the repository, with additional notes indicating it contained all evidence required to reclaim what was stolen and reveal what was hidden. As Jacob studied the complete map, smaller details emerged that connected with items he had already discovered. The miner's lamp he had found was marked at a specific point where the tunnel curved, apparently serving as both illumination and a marker for a safe path across what was labeled a pressure-sensitive floor section. Most remarkable was a series of notations along the margins that appeared to be written in simple code, substituting numbers for letters in a pattern Jacob recognized from games he had played with his grandfather years ago, revealing additional instructions. Carter heirs, remember always that stars guide our path below as above. The constellations of our ancestors mark the only safe crossing. The gravity of what lay before him settled on Jacob's shoulders like the weight of the mountain itself, the map revealing not just a physical path but a journey through his family's legacy, a test designed to ensure that only those with Carter blood and knowledge could access whatever evidence had been preserved for generations against corporate enemies who would destroy it to protect their interests. With trembling hands, Jacob carefully photographed the assembled map using his phone, then created a smaller, hand-drawn version in his notebook that would be easier to carry, before separating the original pieces and returning them to their respective hiding places for safekeeping. Tomorrow his parents would be gone all day for another of his mother's treatments at the hospital 2 towns over, providing the perfect opportunity for his expedition into the mountain's depths, a journey he now realized had been waiting for him since before his birth. A destiny encoded in his very blood, according to his grandfather's belief that only a Carter could safely navigate what Jeremiah had built to protect the truth. Morning mist still clung to the mountainside as Jacob approached the hidden door, backpack containing essential supplies slung over his shoulder. Scout alerted his side as both boy and dog paused to ensure they hadn't been followed. The brass key turned smoothly in the ancient lock once more, the door swinging inward with that same release of cool, mineral-scented air that carried the breath of secrets long undisturbed. Jacob switched on the powerful flashlight he had taken from his father's emergency kit, its beam cutting through darkness that felt almost solid after a century of uninterrupted rain, revealing the tunnel extending before them just as the map had indicated. Taking a deep breath that tasted of damp stone and history, Jacob stepped across the threshold with Scout pressing reassuringly against his leg, the weight of generations seeming to settle on his 10-year-old shoulders as the darkness embraced them. The initial passageway was roughly hewn, but transitioned quickly to worked stone with supporting timbers that had somehow resisted rot despite their age. The craftsmanship speaking to his great-great-grandfather's engineering expertise. Jacob consulted his hand-drawn copy of the map frequently, the beam of his flashlight revealing details that confirmed he was on the correct path. Stone markers bearing the circular Carter symbol, rusted metal brackets that once held oil lamps, boot prints from long-dead miners preserved in what had once been mud, but had hardened to stone-like consistency. The first chamber they encountered matched the map precisely, a widened space where the ceiling rose high enough that Jacob's flashlight couldn't illuminate it fully, creating the impression of a void extending infinitely upward into the mountain. Against the walls stood the ghostly shapes of ancient mining equipment, preserved by the constant cool temperature and dry air. Ore carts with wooden wheels, their metal components dulled by oxidation but still recognizable, pickaxes with handles hardened to near petrification, a hand-cranked ventilation system whose leather bellows had long since cracked and split, but whose brass fittings still carried a hint of their original luster. Jacob moved carefully through this museum of industrial archaeology, Scout staying close as the dog's enhanced senses catalogued the complex tapestry of scents that told stories beyond human perception. It was Scout who first detected something amiss, his nose working furiously near a section of wall where several tools had been arranged too neatly, lacking the random positioning that abandonment would naturally create. Jacob's flashlight beam revealed what the dog had already sensed, disturbed dust patterns indicating that someone had been here recently, examining and moving objects, their footprints partially obscured by apparent attempts to cover their tracks but still detectable to observant eyes. More concerning were several small metal stakes driven into the ground with thin wire connecting them, modern equipment that certainly hadn't been part of the original mining operation, their purpose unclear but suggesting some kind of survey or measurement had been conducted. Jacob photographed these modern intrusions with his phone before consulting the map again, noting that the path ahead led to the first significant challenge his ancestor had designed. Before proceeding, he removed the antique miner's lamp from its alcove near the entrance, finding that it still contained usable oil that ignited when he struck one of his father's matches against the rough stone wall, the warm yellow flame providing a different quality of illumination that somehow seemed more appropriate than the harsh electric beam of the flashlight. With this connection to the past now lighting their way, Jacob and Scout advanced deeper into the tunnel system, the boy's mind racing with questions about who had been here before them, and whether they had managed to penetrate further into the mountain's secrets, or had been thwarted by the protective measures Jeremiah Carter had so carefully engineered. The map warned that the first true test lay just ahead, and Jacob found himself whispering a quiet prayer that whatever blood connection his grandfather had believed would protect him would prove strong enough to guide him safely through the challenges that awaited. The tunnel narrowed as Jacob and Scout pressed forward, the ancient timber supports creaking softly overhead like the whispered conversations of ghosts from another century, the air growing noticeably cooler and damper with each step deeper into the mountain. Following the path marked on his map, Jacob navigated a series of turns designed to confuse unwelcome explorers, carefully checking for the Carter symbols carved at crucial junctions to confirm they remained on the safe route. Scout padding silently beside him, with ears constantly alert to sounds beyond human perception. The gradual descent became more pronounced until Jacob detected the unmistakable sound of flowing water echoing from somewhere ahead, growing louder until the tunnel abruptly opened into a vast cavern split by an underground stream that glittered in the beam of his flashlight like a ribbon of liquid diamonds flowing through the heart of the mountain. Ancient wooden platforms extended along both banks of the subterranean waterway, while iron tracks ran parallel to the stream, disappearing into a tunnel on the far side of the cavern that must lead even deeper into the network of passages. Jacob consulted the map, confirming that this intersection matched precisely with his great-great-grandfather's detailed drawings, including a notation indicating that the stream passage was the correct route forward, while two other visible tunnels led to dead ends or defensive traps. Secured to a crude wooden dock by a chain that had somehow resisted a century of corrosion, sat an ore cart, its metal body dented but intact, wooden slat benches still solid within its confines. The whole apparatus, resting on wheels, aligned with the iron tracks that followed the underground stream. With growing excitement, Jacob examined the cart, discovering that despite its age, the wheels turned smoothly when pushed, the bearings apparently protected from moisture by the same engineering ingenuity that had created the entire tunnel system. Following instructions from the map, Jacob located a hidden compartment beneath one bench containing a lever mechanism detached from its mounting, which, when reinserted into a slot near the front of the cart and secured with a metal pin, created a functional brake system that would allow control of their speed. Scout jumped into the cart with surprising eagerness, as if the German shepherd sensed this was exactly what they were meant to do, his ancestors perhaps having ridden these same rails alongside carters from previous generations. After double-checking that his backpack was secure and his flashlight firmly gripped, Jacob pushed the cart forward until gravity took hold on the gentle decline, the ancient wheels finding their remembered rhythm on the iron tracks with a hypnotic clickety-clack that echoed throughout the cavern, carrying them forward into the unknown. The stream passage widened dramatically as they traveled, the cart picking up speed that Jacob carefully modulated with the brake lever, their journey illuminated by his flashlight sweeping across walls that suddenly blazed with reflected light from thousands of crystal formations that had grown undisturbed for millennia. Jacob gasped at the breathtaking beauty surrounding them, crystal structures in shades of blue, purple, and white extending from floor to ceiling like a natural cathedral crafted by patient underground deities. Some formations taller than houses, others delicate as frost patterns on winter windows, all catching and multiplying his light beam into countless rainbow refractions that danced across the rock walls and rippling water surface. Scout stood with front paws on the cart edge, ears perked forward in alert wonder as they glided through this hidden wonderland, the air filled with the music of water dripping from crystal to crystal, in perfect crystalline tones that seemed to form melodies just beyond human comprehension. Time seemed suspended in this magical realm as the cart carried them ever deeper beneath the mountain. Jacob understanding now why his ancestor had constructed this elaborate underground railway, not merely for practical mining transport but to safely navigate travelers through one of nature's most spectacular hidden treasures, a secret world that had remained untouched by human greed or exploitation, protected by the elaborate defenses that kept Meridian and its agents from penetrating this far into the mountain's mysteries. The crystal cavern gradually narrowed as the tracks descended deeper, the cart slowing naturally as the grade leveled out, finally coming to rest at a crude stone platform that marked the end of the rail line. Jacob helped Scout jump down before climbing out himself. Consulting the map which indicated they had reached what his ancestors had labeled the First Guardian, the chamber where Jeremiah's ingenuity would separate those worthy of proceeding from those who would be trapped, or turned back. The passage ahead appeared initially unremarkable, a squared tunnel with worked stone walls. But as Jacob advanced cautiously with his flashlight sweeping the surfaces, the beam revealed an elaborate mechanism built into the ceiling and walls, consisting of interlocking metal gears, pressure plates embedded in the floor, and what appeared to be release triggers connected to massive stone blocks suspended above the passage. At the center of the chamber stood a circular stone platform engraved with the now familiar Carter symbol, surrounded by a series of metal discs embedded in the floor, each bearing different astronomical symbols that Jacob recognized from his science textbooks, constellations representing Ursa Major, Orion, Cassiopeia, and others arranged in a pattern that seemed deliberately meaningful. The map had mentioned "Stars guide our path below as above," and his grandfather's journal contained repeated references to how Jeremiah had been fascinated by astronomy, believing the stars had guided him to the discovery that had changed the family's fortunes. Jacob played his flashlight across the walls, discovering additional constellation patterns carved into the stone, some positioned directly above pressure plates that would clearly trigger the defensive mechanisms if stepped upon. Scout whined softly, refusing to advance further into the chamber, his animal instinct sensing the danger that human eyes might miss, prompting Jacob to proceed alone with extreme caution. Recalling the journal entry about "the constellations of our ancestors mark the only safe crossing," Jacob considered what this might mean, remembering a conversation with Mr. Harrison about how the Carter family had originally come from Scotland, where their ancestors had been shepherds guided by the stars during nighttime watches over their flocks. With sudden clarity, Jacob realized that the safe path must correspond to constellations visible in the Scottish night sky during the season when his ancestors would have tended their flocks, the spring constellations that would have been most important to shepherds watching their newborn lambs under star-filled skies. Carefully testing his theory, Jacob stepped onto the metal disc bearing the Leo constellation, the first major spring constellation, holding his breath as his weight settled fully upon it, releasing it only when no triggering mechanisms activated. Emboldened but still cautious, Jacob proceeded to step from one spring constellation to another, following their natural progression across the night sky. Leo to Virgo to Boetis, avoiding the tempting but dangerous winter and summer constellations that would have triggered the stone blocks to fall and seal the passage permanently. Scout watched intently from the safe platform as Jacob completed the celestial pathway, finally reaching the circular Carter symbol at the center where his foot triggered a different kind of mechanism. This one causing the sound of turning gears to echo throughout the chamber as sections of the floor bearing the incorrect constellations retracted to reveal deep pits below, while simultaneously a hidden door slid open in the far wall, exposing the continuation of the tunnel beyond the Guardian. Jacob beckoned Scout, who now bounded confidently across the remaining safe constellation disks to join his master, both of them passing through the newly revealed doorway that led deeper into the mountain's secrets. Once they had crossed safely, Jacob heard the mechanisms reset behind them, the floor sections returning to their original positions, ready to test the next visitor who might never realize that the key to safe passage lay not in technical knowledge of mining or geology, but in the cultural heritage and ancestral wisdom that flowed through Carter veins. Exactly as Jeremiah had intended when he designed a defense that could be navigated only by his descendants, who carried not just his blood, but his stories through the generations. The tunnel beyond the Guardian descended at a steeper angle, requiring Jacob and Scout to navigate carefully along ancient stone steps, worn smooth by the passage of mining boots a century earlier, the air growing noticeably warmer as they penetrated deeper into the mountain's heart. After nearly 30 minutes of cautious progress, the passage leveled out and widened, terminating at a heavy wooden door banded with iron, bearing not just the Carter family symbol but a nameplate that sent shivers down Jacob's spine: Jeremiah Carter, Chief Engineer. Unlike the first entrance, this door featured a simple iron handle rather than a lock, suggesting that anyone who had successfully navigated the Guardian's test was deemed worthy of entry to what lay beyond. Taking a deep breath, Jacob pushed the door open to reveal a sight that momentarily stole his breath: a perfectly preserved office that appeared frozen in time, untouched since the day his great-great-grandfather had sealed it away from the world. Oil lamps still stood ready on wooden desks covered with leather-bound ledgers and stacks of yellowed papers, shelves lined with geological specimens and technical manuals, maps and blueprints carefully rolled and labeled, even a pot-bellied stove, with wood stacked beside it, as if awaiting a match despite the decades of abandonment. Scout padded silently across the threshold, sniffing curiously at this strange time capsule, while Jacob moved toward the central desk, where an open journal lay beside an ornate wooden box, its leather cover bearing his ancestors' flowing handwriting. The evidence is now complete. The final entry read, and confirms beyond any doubt that Sierra Nevada Mining has systematically falsified their claim boundaries, extracting gold and rare earth minerals from native lands they do not legally own while disposing of toxic extraction chemicals into the watershed that feeds 3 communities downstream. Jacob's hands trembled as he opened the wooden box, revealing gleaming gold specimens nestled alongside chunks of unfamiliar blue-green ore, each carefully labeled with locations and dates that corresponded with ledgers spread across the desk, their columns showing 2 distinct sets of numbers labeled reported yield and actual yield. The discrepancies between them staggering. Most damning were official-looking documents bearing the company seal, including original survey maps showing property boundaries that differed dramatically from the publicly filed versions, proving that the company had been mining far beyond their legal claims, while bribing government officials to overlook the discrepancy. A separate leather portfolio contained correspondence between company executives discussing the need to eliminate the Carter problem permanently after Jeremiah had confronted them with his discoveries, followed by legal papers showing how they had publicly accused him of theft to discredit him before he could expose their crimes. The final piece of evidence was a signed affidavit from a company whistleblower who had witnessed executives deliberately contaminating water samples to hide toxic levels of mercury and arsenic that their extraction processes were releasing into local streams. The document notarized but never filed with authorities, presumably suppressed by the same corruption that had allowed the company to operate with impunity. In a glass case mounted on the wall hung a newspaper clipping with the headline, "Mining Engineer Accused of Theft Disappears with Fortune," the public story that had tarnished the Carter name while the truth remained locked away in this mountain vault, preserved by generations of family guardians until someone worthy could bring it to light. Jacob stood in silent awe, Understanding at last that his great-great-grandfather hadn't been a thief, but a whistleblower who had discovered corporate crimes so significant that the company that became Meridian Mining had spent over a century trying to bury the evidence. Evidence that now rested in the hands of a 10-year-old boy whose dog had led him to secrets that could finally clear his family's name and bring justice to generations of deception. A narrow door, partially concealed behind a geological cabinet at the rear of the office, caught Jacob's attention as Scout pawed insistently at its base. The dog's instincts once again guiding them toward hidden secrets that generations of corporate interests had failed to discover. Unlike the main entrance, this door featured a complex locking mechanism with rotating rings bearing astrological symbols, similar to those in the Guardian's chamber, arranged in a pattern that would have been meaningless to anyone without knowledge of Carter family history. Jacob consulted his grandfather's journal, finding a dog-eared page containing what appeared to be a simple family tree, but with constellation symbols marking significant births rather than dates. A code hiding in plain sight that allowed him to align the lock's concentric circles to match the stellar positions recorded for Jeremiah's birth. The mechanism yielded with a satisfying click, the door swinging inward to reveal a small chamber hewn directly from the living rock of the mountain, its walls lined with metal to protect against moisture. A single shelf supporting a large iron-bound chest, alongside several wooden boxes stamped with official government seals. Jacob lifted the chest lid with trembling fingers, discovering not the gold he had half expected but something far more valuable: leather portfolios containing legal documents dating back to the 1842, their wax seals and ribbon bindings still intact despite the passage of time. The topmost folder contained original land grant documents bearing the signature of President James K. Polk, officially deeding the entire mountain and surrounding valley to the indigenous people who had inhabited it for generations, with signed treaties establishing their exclusive mineral rights and protection from encroachment by mining operations. Beneath these lay transfer deeds, showing how tribal elders had legally granted specific mining and development rights to Jeremiah Carter in exchange for medical assistance during a devastating smallpox outbreak. A transaction conducted with honor and officially recorded with federal authorities but subsequently erased from county records through corporate manipulation. Most damning were documents bearing the Sierra Nevada Mining Company's own letterhead, detailing their systematic campaign to invalidate the original grants through falsified surveys, bribed officials, and forged transfer documents, creating a paper trail of fraud that extended to the highest levels of government. Jacob carefully unrolled a large map showing the true boundaries of Carter family holdings based on the original legal documents, a territory encompassing not just their small cabin property, but nearly 3,000 acres of prime mountain land, including the area where Meridian Mining now planned their new extraction operation. A leather-bound volume labeled Evidence of Crimes contained methodically organized proof of how the company had orchestrated Jeremiah's public disgrace, manipulated land records, and systematically stolen not just material wealth but the very legacy that should have supported generations of Carters, all while poisoning local watersheds and destroying sacred indigenous sites in their relentless pursuit of profit. Scout whined softly, perhaps sensing the profound emotion overwhelming his young master as Jacob grasped the true magnitude of what his ancestors had preserved and what his family had lost. Understanding now why his grandfather had been so determined to protect these records, and why Meridian had been willing to pay any price to ensure they remained buried forever. With hands that shook from the weight of responsibility suddenly thrust upon his young shoulders, Jacob carefully gathered the most crucial documents and secured them in his backpack, knowing that what he carried was worth far more than gold or land. It was the truth that could restore not just his family's rightful ownership but their honor, a legacy of integrity that had survived a century of corporate deception and was now, finally, ready to emerge into the light of justice through the courage of a 10-year-old boy and his faithful dog, who had followed ancient instincts to uncover secrets that could transform their future. Jacob froze as the unmistakable sounds of voices echoed through the tunnel behind them, their words still indistinct but their presence undeniable, the flashlight beams visible now as dancing reflections on the chamber walls growing brighter with each passing second. With heart pounding, he quickly doused his own light and gestured for Scout to follow him behind the massive geological cabinet that partially concealed the vault entrance, his mind racing to recall if he had left any obvious signs of their presence in the outer office. The voices grew clearer as heavy footsteps entered the preserved workspace. At least 3 different men, judging by their conversational patterns, their tones carrying the unmistakable authority of corporate executives rather than common workmen. "This has to be it," a deep voice announced with satisfaction. "Carter's secret office, just like the old surveys indicated. Untouched for nearly a century." Another voice, higher-pitched and impatient, responded as flashlight beams played across the room, illuminating the collections of documents and specimens. "Check everything, particularly anything that looks like original deeds or mineral surveys. The legal team needs those destroyed before the EPA inspection next month." Jacob carefully extracted his phone from his pocket, opening the recording app and setting it to capture the damning conversation. His hands trembling, but his mind focused on preserving evidence that might otherwise be lost forever. "The old man almost found this place," a third voice commented. "Those journal entries the team recovered from his cabin mentioned the tunnel system, but he never managed to bypass the defensive mechanisms. Good thing, too. Or we wouldn't have been able to move forward with the extraction permits." Metal cabinets opened and closed as the men systematically searched the office, their flashlights occasionally sweeping dangerously close to the hiding place where Jacob and Scout remained perfectly still, the dog displaying remarkable discipline despite his natural instinct to protect his master. "Once we secure these documents, we can proceed with the fracking operation regardless of what the Carter family thinks they own," the deep-voiced man stated with chilling finality. "The chemicals we need to use aren't exactly approved for watersheds this close to residential areas, but with the original surveys gone, there will be no way to prove the water contamination originated on land we're responsible for." Jacob watched through a tiny gap between cabinet and wall as one of the men examined the desk where the journal and specimens still lay exposed, thankfully failing to notice the partially open vault door behind the cabinet or the fresh footprints in the century-old dust that might have betrayed their presence. When the men moved toward the far side of the chamber to examine a collection of maps, Jacob carefully unfolded the hand-drawn copy of the tunnel system. Locating what the original map had labeled as a maintenance passage, a narrow secondary tunnel that bypassed the main entrance and emerged in the forest nearly a quarter-mile from the well. With excruciating slowness, he eased the vault door closed to conceal their escape route, then signaled Scout to follow as they crept along the wall furthest from the searching men, taking advantage of the deep shadows and the executive's preoccupation with their discovery. The secondary passage entrance was concealed behind a movable section of rock wall, activated by pressing specific points in sequence, just as indicated on the map, the mechanism still functioning perfectly despite decades of disuse. As the stone panel slid aside with only the faintest whisper of movement, Jacob and Scout slipped into the narrow maintenance tunnel, pausing only long enough to ensure the entrance sealed completely behind them before illuminating their path with the flashlight now safely hidden from the men who continued their search, unaware that the most damaging evidence had already been removed and that their incriminating conversation had been captured for authorities to hear. The maintenance passage was cramped and clearly designed for emergency use rather than comfortable transit, but it offered safe passage away from the corporate intruders whose voices faded behind them as Jacob and Scout made their escape, the backpack of documents and recorded confession weighing heavily on the boy's shoulders, yet somehow lightening his heart with the knowledge that justice for his family now seemed possible for the first time in generations. The maintenance tunnel emerged exactly where the map had indicated, a concealed opening behind a cluster of boulders half a mile from the cabin, the afternoon sun momentarily blinding Jacob after hours in the mountain's darkness as Scout bounded ahead, alert to sounds that reached the dog's sensitive ears before Jacob could detect them. Following his faithful companion through the forest, Jacob began to hear raised voices carrying through the trees, his father's angry tone unmistakable even at a distance, prompting him to break into a run with the precious backpack bouncing against his shoulders, emerging from the tree line to find a scene of confrontation on their cabin porch. His parents standing defiantly before Richard Blackwood and two other Meridian executives, all three men in business attire that seemed increasingly disheveled as the argument escalated. Jacob's mother noticed him first, relief washing over her worried features as he approached, while his father continued addressing the executives with barely contained fury. "We've already called the sheriff about the break-in," his father was saying, "and we're withdrawing from any potential sale agreement until we have answers about why your people were searching our property without permission." Blackwood's practiced corporate smile had vanished, replaced by a cold calculation as he responded, "The preliminary agreement you signed gives us rights to conduct surveys, Mr. Carter, And I assure you our team was merely assessing geological features as specified in paragraph 12. Jacob stepped forward, Scout at his side. The dog's hackles raised as he growled softly at the corporate men who represented the same threat his canine ancestors had been trained to recognize. They weren't conducting surveys, Jacob announced with a confidence that drew every eye to him, his young voice steady despite his racing heart. They were looking for these. He carefully removed the leather portfolio of original land grant documents from his backpack, handing them to his stunned father while maintaining eye contact with Blackwood, whose face had drained of color at the sight of papers he had believed lost forever. My great-great-grandfather didn't steal from the mining company, Jacob continued, extracting additional documents that his father accepted with trembling hands. He discovered that they were stealing from native lands and poisoning the water, just like Meridian Mining is planning to do now. The third executive stepped forward, authority evident in his bearing as he addressed Jacob's father rather than the boy. Whatever old papers you think you've found are irrelevant to current operations, he stated dismissively. Our legal team has established clear title to the mineral rights through properly filed modern documentation. Jacob pulled out his phone, tapping the screen to access the recording he had made in the mountain chamber, the executive's own voice filling the tense silence. Once we secure these documents, we can proceed with the fracking operation regardless of what the Carter family thinks they own. The chemicals we need to use aren't exactly approved for watersheds this close to residential areas, but with the original surveys gone, there will be no way to prove the water contamination originated on land we're responsible for. The transformation on the executive's face was immediate and dramatic, confidence crumbling into shock and then calculated damage control as he signaled urgently to his colleagues. This child has clearly fabricated evidence, he began, but Jacob's father had already opened the portfolio, examining deeds bearing presidential signatures and legal seals, maps showing the true boundaries of Carter Holdings, and company documents detailing generations of deliberate fraud, his expression transforming from confusion to dawning comprehension, and finally to righteous anger. These are original government documents, he said quietly, the calm in his voice more threatening than any shouting could have been. And this recording doesn't sound fabricated to me. Jacob's mother moved to stand beside her husband and son, the family united as she added with quiet dignity, the sheriff should be here any minute to discuss the break-in. And I suspect the EPA investigators and tribal authorities will be very interested in comparing these original land grants with whatever modern documentation your legal team has manufactured. Scout positioned himself protectively before the family as the corporate men exchanged glances filled with rapidly calculating options, their carefully constructed plans unraveling before the evidence a 10-year-old boy and his dog had managed to uncover from secrets buried for generations beneath the mountain they had foolishly believed they could control. Autumn painted the mountains in brilliant hues of red and gold as the Carter family stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by townspeople who had gathered to witness what the local newspaper had dubbed the reckoning of Meridian Mining. 3 months had passed since the confrontation at the cabin, months filled with depositions and emergency court hearings as the company desperately attempted to suppress the evidence Jacob had discovered, only to face a community that had awakened to generations of corporate manipulation and environmental abuse. Inside the dignified courtroom with its polished wooden benches and state seal, Jacob's father had presented the original land grants and treaties to a judge who treated the documents with appropriate reverence, ordering them preserved by court archivists, while experts verified their authenticity against federal records that miraculously still existed despite Meridian's best efforts to expunge them. The company's legal team had arrived with confident smiles that faded as they confronted not just the Carter family but an entire community standing in solidarity, including Miss Winters, who had provided historical context from town records she had protected for decades, tribal representatives whose ancestral claims were vindicated by Jeremiah's meticulous documentation, and environmental scientists who confirmed that water sample data preserved in the mountain office matched exactly with modern contamination patterns that Meridian had repeatedly denied responsibility for. Most surprising had been Mr. Harrison's testimony, the old man revealing that he had spent 40 years quietly collecting evidence of Meridian's illegal activities, photographing company vehicles dumping waste in protected watersheds, recording conversations with former employees who had witnessed falsification of environmental reports, and maintaining a detailed timeline of cancer clusters that corresponded precisely with mining operations. the company had conducted while evading proper oversight. The judge's preliminary ruling had sent shockwaves through corporate headquarters and brought jubilation to the mountain community. The original land grants were deemed legally binding. The subsequent transfers to Jeremiah Carter properly executed and recorded, and all mineral rights that Meridian had claimed were invalidated by the mountain of evidence proving systematic fraud spanning generations. Furthermore, the court ordered a comprehensive accounting of all resources extracted from Carter lands over the past century, with independent experts estimating compensation potentially reaching into hundreds of millions when adjusted for inflation and interest. Funds that would not merely restore the family's fortune, but could establish trusts for environmental remediation and health care for communities affected by contamination. Jacob watched with quiet pride as his father addressed reporters on the courthouse steps, explaining how the settlement would establish conservation protections for the mountain watershed, while funding research into cleaning techniques for the damaged ecosystem. His mother, standing beside him with color returned to her cheeks thanks to proper medical care that was no longer a financial burden. Scout lay contentedly at Jacob's feet, the German shepherd somehow understanding that their shared quest had fulfilled a purpose that stretched back through generations of both their bloodlines, a partnership forged in the defense of truth and justice. The corporate executives who had once threatened their future now faced their own legal troubles, the recorded conversation proving intent to violate environmental regulations and destroy evidence, with federal investigators examining connections between Meridian's operations and similar patterns of fraud and contamination at their mining sites across 3 states. That evening, the Carter family hosted a gathering at their cabin, the porch expanded by neighbors who had volunteered their carpentry skills, tables laden with potluck dishes prepared by townspeople who now viewed the family not as struggling newcomers, but as rightful stewards of the mountain heritage that belonged to the entire community. Mr. Harrison sat in the place of honor, his weathered face alight with satisfaction as he raised a toast to Jacob, the true heir of Jeremiah's courage, while Miss Winters presented the boy with a bound collection of historical documents she had assembled, chronicling the Carter family's century-long fight for justice, ensuring that future generations would remember how truth had finally emerged from the mountain's depths through the persistence of a boy and his faithful dog. Spring returned to the mountain with an explosion of wildflowers carpeting the slopes of the newly established Carter Family Nature Preserve, marked by a handsome wooden sign at the entrance gate where visitors now came to hike carefully, maintain trails, and learn about the delicate ecosystem Jacob's ancestors had fought to protect. The cabin had been expanded into a visitor center, its walls displaying photographs and documents chronicling both the environmental heritage of the region and the century-long struggle for justice that had finally been won. Jacob stood on the ridge overlooking the valley, Scout lying contentedly beside him, both watching as his father guided a group of environmental science students through the crystal cavern that had been carefully opened to limited educational access, his passionate voice carrying upward as he explained the importance of responsible stewardship. Near the preservation greenhouse where native plants were cultivated for restoration projects, Jacob's mother worked alongside botanical researchers, her health fully restored thanks to treatments the settlement had easily afforded, her scientific background now dedicated to documenting and protecting the mountain's unique flora. In the town square, a bronze statue depicted a German shepherd with alert ears and vigilant posture, the plaque commemorating Scout and all faithful companions who protect what matters most. The dog himself seemingly unaware of his celebrity, as he continued his daily patrols of the property with the same dedication his tame ancestors had shown. As sunset painted the mountains with golden light, Jacob fingered the small gold nugget from Jeremiah's original discovery that he carried as a reminder, understanding now that the true treasure had never been the mineral wealth or even the reclaimed land rights, but the legacy of integrity that connected him to generations of Carters who had valued truth above all else. A heritage that had waited patiently within the mountain until he was ready to carry it forward into a future now bright with possibilities.